Hello students, today we will be discussing about the international relations theory, which are of two types. First, there are mainstream theories and then there are critical theories that came as a reaction against mainstream theories. So, today we will be discussing about classical realism. We will be proceeding like this. First, we will be talking of the necessity of theory in international relations. Then we will be talking about the background of realism. Then we will go to the intellectual roots of realism, and then we will discuss the core elements of realism. So, now let me focus on the necessity of theory in international relations. When we discuss about theory to the students of international relations, they have a different kind of perception. Sometimes the attitude towards theory vary among students of international relations, and it may sometimes happen that they are either suspicious of it, or they are frightened of it, or sometimes even hostile to it. Students generally they don't like to study theories, so that is the general perception, because theory is often proclaimed as too difficult, too abstract, or irrelevant to the real world. So, most of the students of IR not only find theories difficult, sometimes they also think that they are very strange kind of perceptions, or they are not basically relevant to understand anything. So, sometimes they feel so boring, sometimes they feel so uninteresting about the theories that they don't develop any interest in different kind of theories, and that subsequently affect their command in the subject. In that way you can understand that actually theories are your backbone. So, if you are strong in theories, so that will help you to grow, to do good scholarship in international relations. So, that is why we will do two things. First, we will try to make it as interesting as possible, and secondly we will understand all the theories in a very detailed way. However, theories is not something one can choose to avoid. Rather, in the process of giving meaning to the things, people, events and controversies in the real world, we are engaged in explicitly or otherwise. So, theories help us to give meaning to something which is not otherwise deeply understood, or which is superficially understood. So, in that way theories help us to have a kind of deeper understanding of something which is happening either inside the country or outside the country. In particular, we can't simply observe everyday world of international relations without giving theoretical meaning to what is happening in our day-to-day life. And in this process of observation, we might well add different meanings on the same event as we theorize the real world things in different ways. So, theories help us to understand one particular thing in a very different way. So, they are just like colored glasses. So, the kind of colored glasses you wear, you look at the world in that shade. So, that is how theories help us not only to understand the real world events in a different way or add meaning to it, rather it also help us to have a very comprehensive view and also a very different kind of view. So, if you just want to understand the present Israel and Hamas war, different theories will help you to understand the issue very differently. If you focus on realism, you will understand the Hamas-Israel war from the great power rivalry perspective. There are Arab countries, and Israel is only a democratic country in that particular region. So, there is a need for balance of power. So, and balance of power is always favored in a situation which is asymmetric. That is why America is supporting Israel. So, this is what the realists would say. Liberals would understand it in a very different way. They will look at the rights, how many people are getting killed, what is the need for Israel to respect the rights of the Palestinians. Israel should also respect international law, and both parties should sit together, negotiate. The United Nations should play an important role in bringing these two conflicting parties to the table. Israel should accept the two-state solution. So, the liberals would look at the issue in a very different way. So also the critical theorist. So, when you use any theory, when you apply any theory, that will help you not only to understand the things in a proper perspective, rather it will help you to understand the same thing in different perspectives. Thus, international relations cannot be understood independently of the theoretical frameworks that we give meaning to the world. So, if you want to understand not superficially but deeply by going to its roots, then you need different kinds of theories, you need different kinds of perspectives. Second, the development of international relations as a discipline has seen the progressive enlargement of theoretical imagination as a diverse range of critical theories have challenged the mainstream approaches. So, we discussed about the evolution of the discipline and the growth of the discipline and how the great debates actually help us to understand the growth of the discipline. So, if you look at the different types of theories, as I said, they are of either they are mainstream theories or critical theories. So, different theoretical traditions and challenge to those traditions actually help for the emergence of so many theories in international relations that you need to understand, that you need to have a closer look at those kind of theories. So, that will help you to understand the world in a much better way. So, that is exactly for what we are focusing on theories, we are studying the theories, we are looking at different theoretical perspectives. Now, let me go to the background of realism. The key mainstream perspectives on global politics are the two main theories. The one is realism and the other is liberalism. As the discipline of international relations took shape following the World War I, it drew particularly heavily on liberal ideas and theories, especially about the desirability of conducting international politics within the framework of moral and legal norms. We already discussed about the first debate in the evolution of international relations. So, if realism came as a mainstream theory, it is because of its criticism of liberalism or liberal ideas that particularly wanted to reform international politics and control the interstate relations or control the selfish behavior of the states through international institutions, international law. So, that was the point on the basis of which it was highly criticized by the realists, and that is how realism came as a different theory in international relations. From the late 1930s onwards, such liberal ideas were subject to increasing criticism by the realist theorists who highlighted what they saw as the inescapable reality of power politics. So, the realists actually focus on power politics, they are not interested in reforming international politics, rather they look at the issue, what the issue is, rather what it ought to be. So, that is the point on the basis of which you can understand realism and differentiate realism from liberalism. Realists are political theorists and practitioners who since the interwar years have self-consciously subscribed to this tradition of thought. So, it is not that others are saying that they are realists, rather they are the scholars who consider themselves as realists, and they particularly grew in the interwar period starting from end of the First World War till the beginning of the Second World War. So, that interwar period actually provided a fertile ground for the realists, those who were unhappy with the liberal theory of international relations, and that is how they developing a different kind of tradition, different from the liberal tradition of international relations. We will particularly discuss two broad strands of realist thought, that is, one is the classical realism and the other is called structural or neo-realism, and also there are several other sub-variants that we will also focus during our discussion on neo-realism, and also we will attempt to conceive realism as a unified theory and practice of international relations. So, we will see if there are different variants of realism, classical realism, neo-realism, neoclassical realism, then we have subaltern realism. There are so many variants of realism. So, we will particularly examine whether there is any commonality between all the substrands and strands of realism, or they are different from the main theory of realism. So, that issue we will discuss at the end of our discussion on realism and neo-realism. Now, let me look at the intellectual roots of realism, how they were inspired, whom they consider as their idol, or who actually contributed for the development of realism as a concrete theory of international relations. Like the utopianism in international relations theory, realism has its intellectual roots in the older political philosophy of the West, and also in the writings of non-Western ancient scholars such as Sun Tzu in China and Kautilya in India. So, if you look at the liberal roots from Hobbes and so many, political philosophers belonging to the Western tradition, also to some non-Western tradition, similarly the theory of realism actually, borrows heavily from the both the ancient authors and those who contributed for the growth of realism in different traditions of thought, such as Sun Tzu in China, Kautilya in India, Thucydides in Greece, so Hobbes, Machiavelli. There are so many political philosophers who actually contributed for the growth of the idea of realism in international relations, which was later developed as a separate theory of international relations. Looking at the clash between the great powers of his time, particularly Athens, Sparta and Persia, Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian War searched for the fundamental causes of conflict, the profound logic behind political events and the instruments of power deployed by political actors. So, Thucydides is a historian who studied the history of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, and he particularly looked at the causes of conflict, the kind of logic behind those kind of conflict, and the instrument of power deployed by the competing actors. So, he basically concentrated on war, because war is the ultimate test for those who want to distinguish reality from appearance in international politics. So, if you want to make yourself as a realist, or if you consider yourself as a realist, so you have to understand what actually appears and what is actually behind the region. So, you have to distinguish yourself what a particular event looks like and what are the deeper regions that is responsible for that particular event. So, it is Thucydides who actually made a major beginning to the realist tradition in international politics. The Art of War by Sun Tzu in China is also a renowned guide for how to engage in conflict and how you will be successful in the battle. So, Sun Tzu in China also contributed to a great understanding, or to a great extent, for the understanding of war and the reasons for war, and how, if war erupts, if war is there, how you will be successful in that war. So, that is his special contribution to the tradition of realism, particularly in the understanding of war and conflict. Then we have Kautilya, who is also known as Chanakya. Kautilya's Arthashastra precisely earns him the title of a great political realist, because much of the bedrock assumptions of realism that Europe came to know very late was actually, it was Kautilya who in ancient India grasped them. So, particularly if you look at the realist foundation in international politics, you will find realism perhaps bearing Thucydides, and you will find the concrete kind of realist idea in the writings of Kautilya in his book Arthashastra. Kautilya's vision of international relations, as expressed in Arthashastra, revolves around the concept of balance of power between the circle of states. So, what we call the Rajmandal theory. So, it was Kautilya who was thinking of a statecraft not from outside. He himself was the prime minister. On his political experience during Chandragupta Maurya's time, he developed the ideas of statecraft and wrote that in his book Arthashastra. He advised the king what to do and what not to do, and what kind of policies the king should follow for the neighboring countries, and how he would be a successful king. So, these kind of understandings, these kind of ideas which we consider as a realist tradition in international politics, that was greatly understood by Kautilya. Although we knew about Kautilya only after 1915, when there was a chance discovery of Arthashastra. So, that especially establishes the kind of notion that Kautilya, who actually founded a realist tradition of international politics in India, and present Indian understanding of realism can be greatly traced to the ideas of Kautilya, what he wrote in his book the Arthashastra. In his analysis of interstate relations in the Italian state of the 16th century, Machiavelli emphasized on the need for the ruler to adopt moral standards different from those of the individuals in order to ensure the state survival. So, it was Machiavelli who was a great political philosopher in Italy. He made a distinction between individual morality and state morality. His concern was with power. His assumption that politics is characterized by a clash of interest, his pessimistic view of human nature all these clearly place him within the realist framework. So his understanding of human nature, his understanding of interstate relations, his understanding of statecraft, so everything, everything what he wrote, what he analyzed, that was greatly relevant for the theory of international relations. Hobbes, like Machiavelli, viewed power as a crucial element in human behavior. The realist conceived the anarchical structure of international relations through an analogy with an imaginary and pre-state condition called the state of nature. Hobbes equates this state of nature with the state of war. To escape this intolerable condition, individuals agree to enter into a social contract and install a sovereign power called Leviathan. But although individuals may escape this state of nature, the states they form do not. So basically, it was Hobbes who had given this concept of state of nature that is used as anarchy in international relations, a condition that was prevalent before the coming of the state, and how the individuals, the people who were living in the state of nature, they realized that in order to protect their rights, in order to ensure their survival, they have to enter into a social contract, and that led to the establishment of the Leviathan, and how that ultimately contributed for their safety, for their life. So Hobbes' ideas on these issues actually contributed to a major extent to the realist tradition in international politics. Hegel elevated the position of the state. Although realist writers reflect little Hegelianism, Hegel's belief that the state's highest duty is its own preservation is a fundamental of the realist theory. So all the states, they consider their survival as the most important goal or the only permanent goal, and so that idea actually came from Hegel. The state exists apart from its citizens, so state has its own personality. So it's not that state and citizens, they are not the same. So the individuals, they have their own entity, their own personality. The state as a collection of individuals, as an organic whole of the individuals, it has its own entity, own identity. Moreover, the state has moral standards different from and superior to those of the individuals. So if we talk about morality, so definitely this kind of state morality is superior to that of the individual morality. So that was the perception of Hegel, and that contributed in a very significant way to the establishment of realist tradition in international politics. In his analysis of the 20 years crisis that came between World War I and World War II, E.H. Carr, a British political scientist, criticized the leading figures at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 and 20 for allowing wishing to prevail over thinking. So he made a distinction between what you wish and what is actually your thinking. So there is a difference between the two. So you wish the world to be good, but that doesn't mean it is actually going to happen. So he made a distinction between the two, and that in a way contributed, or he can be called as the first realist after the Second World War, who studied and made a distinction between utopian liberalism and realism or scientific realism. By neglecting the importance of power in international politics, they had set the world on an inevitable course to further conflict, because the realists were the people who analyzed the state behavior in terms of power, and the liberals were those who were having wishful thinking for a better international relations, that made them in different course of action in different theoretical traditions. And E.H. Carr is considered as a great thinker who contributed for the scientific development of realism in international politics. Now let me focus on the core elements of realism. There are three core elements that can be identified with the theory of realism, particularly the statism, survival and self-help. They are all present among the different strands of realist tradition, or you may think of classical realism, you may think of neo realism or many variants of realism, but these are the 3 points that unite all the different traditions of realism. The realists trace the corrupting and pervasive influence of power on human relations, including international relations. You must have heard the famous saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. So taking a cue from that saying, you can say that the realists actually are aware of the corrupting and the pervasive influence of power on human relations. The more powerful you become, the more there is a chance that you will be more corrupt. So that goes the rationale. Some have suggested that this formulation betrays a basic theoretical fault line within realism, dividing it into different schools of thought. There are people who think that because all the realists they are united on these three important issues, so it is not right to make a distinction between different traditions of realism. One of these, the classical realism, explains power politics in terms of egoism, while the other, the new realism, or what we call the structural realism, explain it in terms of anarchy. So there is a distinction between these two main traditions of realism. One is focusing on human nature, the egoistic nature of the human beings, and the other is about structural realism that put it apart from the classical tradition of realism. However, these alternative approaches reflects more on a difference of emphasis within the realism rather than a division into the rival schools, and the central assumptions of realism are common to most realist theories, even though they may disagree about which factors are ultimately the most important one. So, even if you think that there are some differences between these different traditions of realism, but you will agree that this is about more about the emphasis within the realist tradition and rather than a division of the school. So, because they are united on the grand narratives of realism, so it is not a different schools of thought, rather it is a question of difference on emphasis. So, that is how although there are different theoretical traditions in realism, or there are different traditions of realism itself, but actually they are all united on some common points. The realists consider that the sovereign state has been the principal actor in international politics. This is often referred as the state-centric assumption of realism. So, if you start with the basic premises of realism, you will find that they give prime importance to the states as the main actor in international politics, and that is why international politics is considered as something like a state-centric kind of system that gives priority to the states as the primary actors. The legitimacy of the state is what enables it to exercise authority within the domestic borders. Yet outside the boundary of the state, realists argue that a condition of anarchy exists. So, the realist makes a distinction between domestic politics and international politics, while domestic politics is characterized by order, law, constitution, and also there is a government in the domestic order that maintains law and order. But in the international politics, there is no world government or no overarching international authority that can control the selfish behavior of the states. So, they make a distinction between domestic politics and international politics. Anarchy means that international politics takes place in an area that has no overarching central authority above individual sovereign states. So, when you talk of anarchy, that does not mean it is chaos, it is disorder. Rather, anarchy in the realist sense of the term means actually the absence of single central authority, the way we find it in the domestic politics, that can control the individual sovereign states' behavior. Under anarchy, the survival of the state cannot be guaranteed. Realists assume that all the states wish to perpetuate their existence. So, realists make a distinction between permanent interest and temporary interest, and this is something your self-sustenance, your self-survival as something on which you cannot compromise. If there is any state that can compromise its existence, it will not remain a state in the way we understand the states. So, self-survival or self-existence is something on which states will not compromise, and if they compromise, they will not be a state. And this is how in order to maintain their existence, they engage in all set of power politics, all set of games against each other. Looking back at history, however, the realists note that the actions some states might have taken to ensure their survival has resulted in other states losing their existence. So, we have seen in history that whenever the state they take any step for their own existence, sometimes that also compromises the existence of other. There was First World War, there was Second World War, there was a lot of imperial competition in India. So you will find that many countries, many great powers, when they take their survival as something very important to them, and because of their survival they also attacked other states because they realize that this kind of war, this kind of occupation will actually help them for their self survival. States with more power have a better chance of surviving than states with less power. So there are great powers, there are major powers, there are superpowers, there are world powers. So realists make a distinction between this kind of powers on the basis of their power position in the international hierarchy. If you are more powerful, you are in a better position to secure your national goals, achieve your foreign policy objectives, and if you are a smaller country, if you are a less powerful country, it makes it very hard to achieve your foreign policy objectives. So that's why realists put a lot of emphasis on how to acquire power or how to maintain power. Thus power is crucial to the realist lexicon and has traditionally been defined narrowly in military strategic terms. We have discussed that issue during our discussion on international politics, that how the realists actually consider power as central to international politics, power as a central instrument or main instrument through which the state can ensure their own survival. So that's why the realists consider power as something that is the real backbone of the states, and when they talk about this power, they particularly highlight the military power in the true sense of the term. Yet irrespective of how much power a given state may possess, the core national interest of all the states must be survival. So power, how you acquire power, in what way you acquire power, you may define your national interest in a very different way, but if you come to this point, they are all agree, or all state would agree, their self survival is the most vital national objective which they cannot compromise, which they cannot forget. So in that way, self survival or survival of the nation state is the prime importance to all the states, and if there is war, if there is competition, if there is balance of power in international relations, it is all because how best you can manage power, how can you balance others' power, so that contributes to your survival, that contributes to your existence in the area of great power competition, in the area of international politics. So self-help is the fundamental principle of a state action in an anarchical system. According to realism, each state actor is responsible for its own survival. So how you give too much importance to power? It's because it is through the principle of self-help you can maintain your national existence, you can maintain your own survival, because you live in a anarchical system where there is no world government, there is no overarching central authority, and it is through the principle of self-help you can maintain your own existence, and that is how the states engage in acquisition of power, engage in acquiring different weapons, engage in different kinds of competition, so that that will really help them to ensure their existence and make them powerful. Realists don't believe that it is prudent for a state to trust in other states for a state's survival and safety. I am talking particularly about the United Nations. So realists think that it is actually the principle of self-help that will help you to ensure your own survival, and this principle is something so important, so crucial for you, that you can't depend on others, particularly the international institutions, for your own survival. The moment you depend on others, you will be considered as something weak, something vulnerable to their manipulation, to their machinations, and that's how you have to focus on the principle of self-help. That is the best help you can do for your own survival. Consistent with the principle of self-help, if a state feels threatened, it would seek to augment its own power by increasing its military capabilities. However, this is not always possible. So if you feel threatened, you can acquire more and more power, but it's not always that everything happens as per your wish. So in that circumstances, what you can do is you have to depend on balance of power, that is balancing the power of others. And it also possible you can also enter into military alliances that can check the power of other states. So it is through balance of power, it is through military alliances you can increase your power, you can get more and more power. Most importantly, the balance of power can preserve a state's independent existence from threat, aggression and hegemony, the domination by a great power and its allies. So basically you have seen during the Cold War how NATO was established, and NATO was providing security to many of the countries in Western Europe, and Cold War period how America was helping for the establishment of NATO and providing all kinds of security, including security from nuclear attack by the former Soviet Union. And Soviet Union had also its own military alliances, the Warsaw Pact. So these military alliances were established during the Cold War period to provide each of the superpowers and also their allies kind of protection they required for their own survival. It is for these reasons that the realists see balance of power as the only real means to achieve common security. So it is through balance of power states, those who are weak states, those who are vulnerable states, they can join the powerful, join their military alliances, and in that way they can attain more power, they can get more power. Nowadays Sweden, Finland, they are all interested in joining NATO, because it is through NATO they can increase their power, they can assure their own survival to Russia. So that is the reason why they are becoming the members of NATO. Diplomacy, the art of communication and negotiation between powers, is an essential part of the conscious preservation of political equilibrium among the states. So on the one hand you have balance of power, on the other hand you have diplomacy, and these are all policies to manage power in international relations, and this is how you can manage others, you can increase your power, you can control others' aggressive tendencies, and in this way you can maintain your self-preservation or self-survival. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. We discussed that international relations cannot be understood independently of the theoretical frameworks that give meaning to things, people, events, and even controversies in and around the world. International relations evolution as a discipline can be understood by a diverse range of critical approaches that have challenged the mainstream theories. Realism and liberalism are the two mainstream perspectives in international relations, and how the realists focus on the realities of power politics differentiated realism from utopian liberalism. The intellectual roots of realism can be traced from the works of scholars like Sun Tzu, Thucydides, Kautilya, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Hegel, and E.H. Carr. There are three core elements of realism in international relations, which can be called as statism, survival, and self-help, which are considered as common to all varieties of realism. In the next lecture, we will continue our discussion on realism and particularly focus on Hans J. Morgenthau's 6 principles of realism. Thank you very much for your attention. See you in the next lecture. Goodbye.